Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really big question. What makes economies grow? Across different countries, throughout history.
Yeah, it's fundamental.
Think of this deep dive as, well, your guided tour through the main ideas economic historians use. Why do some places thrive while others don't?
Right. And we're using a lecture as our starting point today. It covers quantitative history, the tools, the theories, and, importantly, the role of institutions.
So our mission really is to pull out the core concepts. How do experts figure out why economies grow or stagnate? What are the key factors?
Exactly, giving you the essential framework.
Okay, so first things first. To talk about growth, we need to measure it. The lecture starts with real GDP. What is that, and why is it the go-to metric?
Well, real GDP is basically the total value of everything, all the goods, all services a country produces in a year. But, and this is key, it's adjusted for inflation.
Ah, right, the real part.
Exactly. It's our main way of checking if the economy is actually producing more stuff, not just if prices went up. There are three main ways to calculate it.
Okay.
You can look at total spending consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. That's the expenditure approach. Or you can add up all the income, wages, profits, rents.
The income approach.
Yep. Or you could look at the value added at each stage of production. In theory, they should all give you the same number, more or less.
Right, but that number is, in today's prices, the nominal GDP.
Yeah.
You said we need to adjust it. That's where price indexes come in.
Precisely. To get from nominal GDP, today's prices, to real GDP, a measure of actual output change, you need to deflate it. Use a price index for that.
And the lecture mentioned a few different types. Posh, Laspers.
Yeah, Posh, Laspers, Fisher, Ideal. They're just slightly different statistical ways of tracking how a basket of goods changes price over time. But the choice of index matters. Well, which index you pick, and even which year you choose as your starting point, your base year, can slightly change the growth rate you calculate. It introduces a bit of, uncertainty.
And it's not just the index choice, is it? I think the lecture hinted at bigger problems with just using these indexes.
Oh, absolutely. They're useful, but limited. A big one is quality changes. How does an index capture the fact that today's computer is vastly better than one from 20 years ago, even if the price is similar?
Right, or a completely new product appears, like smartphones.
Exactly. How do you factor that in? Or think about measuring the cost of living for the poorest 10%. Does the standard inflation basket really reflect what they can buy?
Good point.
And these problems just get magnified when you look way back, like before the 19th century. The goods available were just so different. Comparing then and now is really, really tricky.
It's like trying to compare apples and, well, something that doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so that's measuring growth within one country. What about comparing across countries? Exchange rates aren't the answer, right?
Definitely not. Exchange rates bounce around for all sorts of financial reasons. They don't tell you much about how much stuff your money actually buys in different places. That's where PPP comes in.
Purchasing power parity.
Yep. The lecture used a good example. Think about getting a haircut or buying a TV. The price in, say, Delhi versus Zurich is wildly different.
Way different.
Right. PPP tries to adjust for that. It calculates the cost of a similar basket of goods and services in each country's local currency, effectively asking, how much money do you need in each place to buy the same amount of stuff?
Okay, so it's trying to compare actual living standards, not just currency values.
Exactly. It gives you a much better sense of relative purchasing power, how rich people really are in different places.
And there are different ways to calculate PPP too. Bilateral, multilateral?
Yeah, bilateral just compares two countries directly. Multilateral methods, like the ones used in the Penn World Tables data set, try to compare a whole bunch of countries consistently.
What's the advantage of multilateral?
Consistency, mainly. If the data says country A is richer than B and B is richer than C, a good multilateral method ensures the data also shows A is richer than C. You don't always get that with just pairwise comparisons.
Got it. Okay, so we have our measurement tools, real GDP, adjusted using indexes, and PPP for comparing across borders. Now, let's get into the drivers. What makes economies grow? The lecture mentioned proximate and deep sources.
Right. That's a really useful distinction. The proximate sources are the immediate inputs that boost output. Think the aggregate production function.
The Y equals AK alpha L 1 minus alpha thing.
That's the one. Y is output, K is capital machines, buildings, L is labor. Alpha is just a number telling you how important capital is relative to labor. And A, that's the really interesting bit.
Technology. Efficiency.
Exactly. Total factor productivity, or TFP. It's basically how effectively you combine the capital and labor. So the proximate sources of growth are getting more capital, getting more labor and better skilled labor, that's human capital, and improving that A factor, better technology, better organization.
Okay, so more inputs or using inputs better. Those are the proximate sources. What about the deep ones?
The deep determinants are the more fundamental factors that influence those proximate sources. Why does one country invest more in capital? Why is technology adopted faster somewhere else? The lecture highlighted two big ones, geography and institutions.
Geography, like climate, resources.
Yeah, that can play a role, definitely. But the lecture really dug into institutions.
Which are?
The rules of the game, as Douglas North famously put it.
Mhm.
The humanly devised constraints that shape how we interact.
We'll definitely circle back to institutions. But before that, the lecture briefly ran through some major growth theories. Can we quickly touch on those? Smith, Solow.
Sure. So Smithian growth, Adam Smith, is all about specialization, division of labor, and trade making everyone more productive.
Makes sense.
Solovian growth, Robert Solow, really emphasizes capital accumulation, investing in more machines and infrastructure and technological progress as the engines of long-run growth. Think post-war Germany rebuilding. Then there's Bose-Sarupian growth, Esther Boserup, which flips things a bit. She argued population pressure can actually drive innovation, especially in farming, forcing people to find better ways to produce food.
Interesting. Necessity is the mother of invention.
Kind of, yeah. Lewisonian growth, Arthur Lewis, focuses on moving labor from a low-productivity traditional sector, like subsistence farming, into a high-productivity modern industrial sector.
Urbanization and industrialization.
Right. And finally, Schumpeterian growth, Joseph Schumpeter. That's all about innovation, entrepreneurs, and creative destruction. New technologies and businesses destroying old ones, driving progress.
Okay, a quick tour of the big ideas. Now, the lecture talked about growth accounting. What is that used for?
Growth accounting is basically a technique. Take that production function we talked about and use real-world data to figure out how much of the observed economic growth comes from each proximate source.
So how much growth is due to more capital, how much to more labor, and how much is that leftover bit, the technology factor?
Exactly. Yeah. You use some math, basically, taking logarithms and looking at changes over time to break down the growth rate of output, Y, into the growth rate of technology, A, plus the growth rate of capital, K, times its importance, alpha, plus the growth rate of labor, L, times its importance, 1 alpha.
So it lets you put numbers on it, like 50% of growth last decade came from technological progress.
Precisely. It helps quantify the contributions, but, and this is important, the lecture also stressed its limitations.
Ah, the caveats. What should we be careful about?
Well, first, the result depends a bit on the exact mathematical form of the production function you assume. And assuming those shares, alpha and 1 alpha, are constant, might not be quite right.
Okay.
More fundamentally, growth accounting shows you what happened, but not necessarily why. It captures the effects, not the deep causes.
Like if a new technology makes capital more productive, you invest more. Growth accounting sees the capital increase, but the real cause was the tech.
Exactly. You can misattribute things. Also, it looks at growth rates, not the overall level of income. And the results can change depending on the exact start and end years you pick for your analysis. It's a tool for dissection, but it doesn't give you the whole story on its own.
Makes sense. A useful tool, but handle with care. Okay, let's dive into those deep determinants now, especially institutions. You mentioned North's definition, the rules of the game. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Institutions are the whole set of formal and informal rules that govern society. Formal rules are things like laws, constitutions, property rights, regulations, the legal system, political systems, education systems.
What's the stuff?
Mostly, yeah. But then you have informal institutions, culture, norms, customs, traditions, codes of conduct, trust levels. These unwritten rules can be just as powerful in shaping behavior.
So it's the whole structure, written and unwritten, that guides how people and businesses operate.
That's right. And they matter hugely for growth because they directly affect those proximate sources we discussed. Good institutions make it easier and safer to invest in physical and human capital. They encourage innovation and technology adoption.
How?
Well, they reduce uncertainty and risk. They lower transaction costs, the cost of actually doing business, like enforcing a contract. They also influence transformation costs, the cost of producing things. Secure property rights, for example, mean you're more likely to invest if you know you'll reap the rewards.
And weak institutions do the opposite.
Right. If property rights are insecure or contracts aren't enforced or corruption is rampant, People are less likely to invest, start businesses, or innovate. That holds back growth. The quality of institutions helps explain why some sectors thrive and ultimately why some countries get rich and others stay poor.
The lecturer gave some examples of areas where institutions are critical.
Yeah, things like, are property rights clearly defined and protected, including intellectual property? How well do labor markets work? Is it easy to hire people, or are there lots of restrictions? How about capital markets? Can businesses get loans easily?
Government plays a role too, obviously.
Absolutely. Are there constraints on what the government can arbitrarily do? Is it rule of law? How easy is it to trade both domestically and internationally? All these are shaped by institutions.
Okay. Now, understanding why certain institutions exist or how they change is complex. The lecture presented 4 different ways of thinking about this: efficiency, accidental, cultural, and conflict. Let's start with efficiency.
The efficiency view basically argues that institutions arise and survive because they're, well, efficient. They find the least costly way for people to interact and transact.
So the best rules win out over time.
That's the strong version, sort of like institutional natural selection. Inefficient rules get competed away. There's also a weaker version that admits some stickiness path dependency, where suboptimal rules might hang around for a while due to history, but the general trend is towards efficiency.
But what does efficient even mean here? The lecture questioned that, right?
Exactly. Efficient for whom? Does it just mean rational individuals maximizing their own utility?
No.
Is it Pareto efficiency? No one can be better off without someone else being worse off? Or is it about maximizing total social output? Defining efficiency isn't simple.
The lecture used the fundamental problem of exchange to illustrate this. What's that?
It's the basic challenge in any trade.
Hmm.
Trust. If I give you my goods, how do I know you'll pay me? Or vice versa. There's an incentive to cheat.
Right.
Institutions can solve this. The lecture mentioned medieval merchant guilds as an example. They created rules, reputation mechanisms, and ways to punish cheaters within the guild. This reduced the risk of trade, made exchange more efficient, and arguably helps drive commercial expansion in Europe.
So efficient institutions solve coordination and trust problems.
Okay, what about the accidental approach? That sounds quite different.
It really is. This view says institutions aren't necessarily chosen for efficiency. They can be the result of historical accidents, random events, contingencies, wars, revolutions, even who happens to be in power at a key moment.
And once they're in place, they stick.
That's the idea of path dependency. An initial, perhaps accidental setup can lock a society onto a particular institutional path, even if it's not the most efficient one. It becomes very hard to change course later.
The Colonial Origins paper was the key example here.
Yeah.
Acemoglu and others.
Yes, that's a classic. They argued that the type of institutions European colonizers set up depended heavily on whether Europeans could actually settle there comfortably.
Based on disease, mortality rates.
Exactly. In places with high settler mortality, like much of Africa, they tended to set up extractive institutions just focused on getting resources out quickly, with little investment in things like property rights or rule of law for the general populace.
Because they didn't plan to stay. Right. But in places with low mortality, like North America or Australia, more Europeans settled permanently and demanded institutions that protected their property and rights, more like the institutions back home.
And these different starting points had long-lasting effects.
That's the argument. These initial, almost accidental institutional setups determined by disease environments decades or centuries ago put these regions on very different long-term development paths. Extractive institutions led to stagnation. Inclusive institutions led to growth.
Wow, that's a powerful idea, history casting a very long shadow. Okay, third approach, cultural. How does culture fit in?
The cultural perspective argues that institutions are shaped by and need to be compatible with the underlying beliefs, values, and norms of a society. Things like religious beliefs, ethics, attitudes towards work or trust.
So institutions reflect culture.
Or are constrained by it, yes. The lecture mentioned a difference between exogenous culture beliefs coming from outside, like religion, and endogenous culture, where the institutions themselves might shape beliefs over time.
What are the implications?
Well, it suggests that just transplanting an institution from one culture to another might not work if it doesn't fit the local beliefs. It also makes policy tricky. You can't easily engineer cultural change.
Examples.
The lecture mentioned things like Max Weber's thesis on the Protestant ethic fostering capitalism, comparisons of European versus non-European attitudes, or how different religious views on things like usury might affect financial institutions.
Okay, so culture provides the bedrock or the context for institutions. Finally, the conflict approach. What's the focus here?
Power. This view sees institutions not as emerging for efficiency or from culture, but as the result of struggles between different groups in society.
Groups fighting over resources.
Exactly. Different groups have different interests, and they fight to create rules that benefit them, that give them a larger slice of the economic pie. Efficiency for the whole society isn't the main goal.
Even if the rules they create actually shrink the total pie.
Potentially, yes. An elite group might prefer an institution that gives them a large share of a smaller pie, rather than a smaller share of a potentially larger pie that would come from more efficient but perhaps more equalizing rules. Distributional conflict shapes the institutions.
The example was medieval craft guilds again. How does the conflict view see them?
So instead of seeing guilds purely as efficiency enhancing, like solving the exchange problem, the conflict view, drawing on work by people like Ogilvy, emphasizes how they serve the interests of the existing master craftsmen.
How?
By restricting entry into the trade, they limited competition, keeping wages and prices high for the insiders. They could stifle new technologies that threaten their skills. They often excluded women, minorities, or migrants. These rules benefited the powerful guild members, even if they arguably held back overall innovation and economic dynamism.
So institutions as battlegrounds for group interests. That's a very different lens. Okay, wrapping up. The lecture showed a table comparing GDP per capita in 1975 using different methods. What did that illustrate?
It really hammered home the PPP point we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
It showed GDP per capita for several countries, India, Kenya, Japan, France, etc., relative to the U.S. It compared results using various sophisticated multilateral PPP methods versus just using market exchange rates.
And the difference was big.
Huge,
Yeah.
especially for the developing countries. India's GDP relative to the U.S., for instance, looked much, much lower using exchange rates than using any of the PPP methods.
Why?
Because the cost of non-traded goods and services, like that haircut we mentioned, is typically much lower in poorer countries. Exchange rates don't capture that, but PPP tries to. So PPP gives a more realistic picture of actual living standards and purchasing power. Using just exchange rates can really underestimate the relative well-being in poorer nations.
Got it. PPP is essential for meaningful comparisons.
Absolutely.
Okay, this has been really clarifying. So just to recap for everyone listening, we've covered how we measure growth, real GDP, adjusting for inflation, and using PPP for cross-country comparisons.
Then the proximate sources adding more capital and labor, including skills, and crucially improving technology or efficiency, that TFP factor.
And the deep determinants behind those, especially institutions, the formal and informal rules of the game. We touched on growth theories and the tool of growth accounting, remembering its limitations.
And finally, those four lenses for understanding institutions. The drive for efficiency, the role of historical accidents and path dependency, the influence of culture and beliefs, and the perspective of ongoing conflict and power struggles.
Right. Hopefully this gives you a solid toolkit for thinking about why some economies succeed and others struggle, looking both at history and the world today.
It's a complex puzzle, but these concepts help us start putting the pieces together.
So a final thought for you to take away, thinking about those four approaches to institutions: efficiency, accident, culture, conflict. Which one resonates most with you when you think about a specific historical case? Maybe a big economic success story or a persistent failure? Which lens seems most useful for explaining that particular outcome, and what kind of evidence would you look for to back it up? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.